Now it's my pleasure to reintroduce Jim. In addition to all the boring stuff, like he is a graduate of Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, has a PhD from Yale, and taught the majority of his career at Calvin in Grand Rapids. I thought I'd mention something more personal. He enjoys visiting his children, who currently live in Milwaukee, Cincinnati, Seattle, and Shanghai. He has flown in or out of 82 airports around the world and wonders how long he can keep that going. He fights the aging process by working out, cross-training and yoga. That's impressive, and thinks heaven will be a lot like the Lake Michigan shoreline, and I agree with that. Welcome, Jim.
Oh, good to be back. Good to see so many of you here, and hello to people in online land. First of all, a little programming note, because the first scheduled presentation of the series was iced out or snowed out, we have to double up next week to do sessions 3 and 4. And after the vote I took last week, it was about 16 to 10. So I'm going to go with the majority. Sorry for a substantial minority, because it also fits my preferences better, to run a morning afternoon split class. So we'll meet at 9:30 next week, 9:30 to 11. We'll have a 2-hour break. Then we'll reconvene as normal at 1 to 2:30. I used to, the year that Tina and I taught in China, I would do 2 75 minutes back to back with a 15-minute break. But I was much younger then. I'm older than that now. So sorry for those of you for whom this is inconvenient. You can, if you can't make the first session here, the morning session here, you can catch it online. And if neither of those works, the first session will be recorded and you can pick it up at a later date. They are non-sequential. Sessions 3 and 4, they are self-standing, so you don't have to have 3 in order to understand 4. In session 3, we're going to deal with all the radicals, the skeptics, the counterpoint to the main theme today, which is evangelicalism. So we're going to be looking at the Millerites, the Mormons, the Shakers, the spiritualists, the radical communitarians, and so forth. That's session 3. And session 4 is religion and the road to the Civil War, or how the strong surge of evangelicalism, which kind of made America a Christian nation, even though it was not founded as a Christian nation. What we're talking about today made America a Christian nation, but that did not solve the worst political problem that the United States ever faced, which is the problem of slavery, making the Civil War not just a political Civil War, but also a religious, and maybe more particularly a Calvinistic Civil War, because the strongest advocates on both sides tended to be come out of the Presbyterian and Congregational heritage, although strong force of abolitionism was also the Quakers, of course. So, yeah, the United States was not founded as a Christian country in the conventional understanding of that term. The Constitution did give a wide range of possibilities for religious activism. And the people we're going to be talking about today, evangelicals, were those best suited, best prepared, and most strategic about seizing those opportunities. So the spread of evangelicalism, or how America became a Christian nation. And the problems, the problem facing the country at the end of the revolutionary process, with the signing of the Constitution, was well spelled out by Linda at the end of the last session. Well, other than hating the king, what do these people have in common? And the answer is not much. And there are a lot of people, particularly cultural and political leaders, who are really worried about that. The Constitution creates an arena in which differences could be hashed out. The Constitution prescribes processes. It doesn't prescribe values or ideas or norms. So it created an arena in which conflict could be resolved. But what are we going to be fighting over, and how are we going to negotiate the outcome of those battles? Problem number one was just keeping up with astounding growth. You see the top map here, the territorial expansion of the United States. At the start of the revolutionary process, the Appalachian Mountains essentially were the western boundary. By a very fortunate, really amazingly gracious provision in the treaty ending the war, Treaty of Paris in 1783, that boundary expanded to the Mississippi River. So just like that, the size of the country doubled. Then Napoleon was running into problems in the Western Hemisphere, and the country expands 20 years later, almost doubles in size again. The Louisiana Purchase, which in the northern section of that purchase runs out to the Continental Divide. And then by precipitating not a tariff war, but a military war with Mexico, the country expands by another third again in the 1840s. So this is really very rapid territorial expansion. This is to people in the East Coast, this is a howling wilderness. How are we going to civilize this? Civilize it. How are we going to bring it into the Union? What's going to keep this from splitting apart? One of Jonathan Edwards's grandsons, Aaron Burr, was arguably engaged in a conspiracy to take the southwest part of this country out of the Union. He was vice president of Thomas Jefferson, right? So that's his first notable accomplishment, perhaps engaging in a secessionist conspiracy. His other main accomplishment was plugging Alexander Hamilton on the heights of Weehawken overlooking the Hudson River. Aaron Burr Jr. had experienced a lot of trauma in his childhood. We can excuse him on that basis, perhaps. But yeah, real worries about territorial secession. See if I can do this. Mr. Technofix. My kids are so proud of me. The other expansion is even more challenging. The U.S. population increases eightfold from 1790, which is the first census, to the verge of the Civil War. If that would happen today, it would mean that by the year 2100, the United States would have about 2.5 billion people. Okay, how in the world do you keep that kind of growth rate, a society growing that rapidly, coherent, together, with any kind of unity? You see in the bottom map here, population density. The dark brown is, now we're measuring here 2 people per square mile, okay? This is not density, density is maybe, but you achieve that in 1770 only in the dark brown places. Let's see, by 40 years later, the lighter brown has averages two people a square mile. 40 years after that, we have the yellow brought into the picture, and the fabled end of the frontier, the filling in of all the gaps by 1890. So we have a remarkable territorial and population expansion here. And how are you going to weave this together to make a coherent nation? One of the great historians of early America, John Murin, taught many years at Princeton, put it memorably in an essay. The Constitution created a country that was a roof without walls. A roof without walls, and therefore also without any furniture. How are you going to complete this house and fill it? What norms, what ideas, what values are going to be common enough that people can agree on them, or if not agree, at least they're arguing about the same thing. It's the arguments that can bind people together as well as total consensus. But what are those going to be? Well, one of the, maybe the most common aspiration, the common value is land hunger. That's why we have all this wonderful territory to expand into. Thomas Jefferson's thought that the Louisiana Purchase was great because it created possibilities of an empire for liberty, an empire for liberty. We have enough land here now to absorb population expansion so that his ideal, the freeholding yeoman farmer, a guy who had enough acreage to supply and provide for his family, this could expand into infinity. And avoid the problem that he saw as ambassador to Paris, ambassador to France, pestilential big cities with all kinds of decadence and class warfare and revolutions. So land hunger is one thing, but raw material aspiration isn't going to really be good for a nation or make for a happy, healthy nation for very long, as we can see what's happened to the United States recently, right? If the market is all that is, there is, and if aspiring for more is all that unites us, then it becomes a zero-sum scramble. I want more, that means you have to have less. So land hunger is not going to be good enough. Law is another commonality because you want to secure your land. So the first thing that you build in a village is a courthouse or a county, or first a land office and then a courthouse to enforce make true title and guarantee true title. But you need something more than that. And that's what evangelicalism aspires and to some extent successfully means to fill. The so-called Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening, if you were here for the last term's course, was the invention of evangelicalism as we recognize it, kind of an instantaneous born-again experience by which everything is reversed, doing this on a mass level. So the born-again experience as the model of true religion, but on a wholesale level. The evangelical God does not work retail. The evangelical God likes big numbers. And so you're always magnifying the size and the scope and the sweep of this thing. So that was the First Great Awakening, 1735 through the 1740s, although it triggers a growth phase in the South that never does die. This is the Second Great Awakening, so-called, by people who are hoping for a renewal or a redoubling of what happened in the colonial period, now in the early nation. And so I'm like a good old-fashioned Christian Reformed sermon. This is coming to you in 3 parts, right? 3 points. First of all, we're going to cover the rise of popular religion, focusing on the Methodists and the Baptists on the frontier, the urban frontier as well as the rural frontier. Secondly, the Congregationalists and Presbyterians, more elite, educated evangelicals, in their cultural crusade to shape public mores, to shape the mind and the heart and the behavior of the new nation. And then thirdly, we have in the Second Great Awakening the beginnings of Black Christianization. For the first time, the gospel is really entering both the slave quarters and the neighborhoods of freed people, be they in the South, Upper South, or in the North. So the Second Great Awakening dividing into these 3 parts. Conventionally, this is identified, the birth phase is identified with the events in Kentucky on the map, Kentucky and Tennessee. The Cane Ridge revival on the wild and woolly frontier, where the Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians come together and sort of invent the camp meeting. This is mass revivalism wholesale for sure. At the same time that's happening there, we have the more elite phase of the revival beginning in New England at Yale College under the auspices of President Timothy Dwight, grandson of Edwards, and also at Andover Seminary in Massachusetts, which was founded as a replacement for Harvard, which had gone heretical, right? Harvard had been taken over by the Unitarians. So we want good Orthodox Christian seminary, and that was Andover. And that's where, between those two, we have the birth of the modern missionary movement. This is where the zeal for domestic and foreign missions, evangelization movements are born. And that happens at Yale in 1795. Andover is founded in 1811. And from those origins, we have the spread of the elite phase or level of the Great Awakening. So first of all, on the popular religious side, we're talking here about Methodists and Baptists. The Cane Ridge Revival on the Kentucky frontier. We have the Cane Ridge Meeting House restored in the upper picture here. And we have the grounds, or what it might have looked like around that church. You can see in the bottom picture the church in the background, but people are really gathered out in the woods. Now, I had as the background piece to the opening a very decorous portrait of a camp meeting, right? Notice we have a vast assemblage of people back in the woods. Tents have been set up to provide for their, for sleeping, because we're going to have several days of nonstop preaching. See on the rostrum here, we have a whole row of guys, and guys they were, that are each going to bring the gospel in turn. And there's a little bit of competition here. See who can trigger the most revivals, okay? But we have the people sitting here, mostly ladies.
Able and figure.
Formal, proper gowns. That's the way it starts, but that's not the way it ends. Say hallelujah. You see the preacher here, the stump speaker. He's literally standing on a stump, exhorting with raised arms and great passion. The goal here again is to trigger a born-again experience right now among a large assemblage of folks. And there are tents set aside. You don't see the tents here, but there are tents set aside where people who are under anxiety, that is, people who are ready to come to Jesus, people who are very repentant of their sins and are sometimes going through spiritual and very often physical throes, spasmodic fits in this context, are taken away, and they're to that tent, and they're given personal counsel by one pastor or assistant or another. So a mass assemblage out in the woods. People have flocked from all over the country, and this is the frontier.
What?
Neighbors. This is a big kind of neighborhood gathering.
They may run out.
Out in the backwoods for days on end, hearing a nonstop exhortation to repent and believe. You can see some of people getting exercised here. These are called religious exercises. But you can see it more dramatically here. The camp meeting in another picture. You see the young ladies no longer sitting properly in their nice gowns, but standing up, doing the holy dance, falling down, being possessed by the Spirit. Lorenzo Dow, the guy pictured on the podium on the right, was a Methodist exhorter, and he was maybe one of the most popular men in America at the time. There were more children named after him than anybody else except for George Washington. So this is an immensely popular guy. You can see the people at his feet, awestruck. An exhorter like him had as his goal the desire to reduce the proud attenders to humility. So a lot of people were coming to these assemblies just out of curiosity. It's the only game in town. Let's go see what it's like. A lot of them were skeptical young men who liked their alcohol, liked their partying, and they came to jeer and mock. And the greatest triumph of the exhorter was to reduce those guys to penitence, and they often did. So there were skeptics, there were opponents, there were the curious, there were the fearful. People came in all kinds of spiritual conditions. The other target besides the carousing young man was the proud young woman dressed all in finery. After my first exhortation, says one of these preachers, I had them shaking till their bonnets came off. And then their stays were loosed. And then they were rolling on the ground, doing the holy jump. I mean, this is a charismatic religion. If you've ever attended a full-throated Pentecostal service, you see this. Not the kind of prim and decorous First Assembly of God stuff, but I mean the real holy rolling, huh? I've seen exactly this behavior in a week morning service in outside of Accra in Ghana, where the whole assembly was rocking with the Spirit. There were men and women who were assigned to go around the back of the group and look for people who were about ready to fall on their backs. So they would catch, these were the catchers in the rye. No, these are the catchers at the revival. So these people would not fall and hurt themselves. In Grand Rapids at First Pentecostal, I've seen women, usually women, doing the holy dance. You see all kinds of people slain in the Spirit. I once kind of stopped the show, much to my chagrin, my embarrassment. So I was the white guy sitting in the back. I'm writing this book on Grand Rapids churches, okay? And I'm sitting in the back. I told them in advance I was coming. Oh, yeah, you're great. You're welcome. And it's really getting going. People are starting to do the holy dance, and they are rolling on the floor. And the pastor's looking out. He's exhorting. He spies me, and he calms it down. We don't want to drive the white boy out of here. So this is kind of it's not the birth, but it's the popularization of a charismatic religious style that remains in strong force today, not just in the United States, but especially around the world. It's kind of invented here. This is the sort of behavior that Jonathan Edwards found shameful and tried to suppress. Cry out to Jesus, he would preach. Cry out to Jesus for forgiveness. Oh, Jesus, cries out. Well, not here, Go back to your private chamber and kind of virtually cry out to Jesus, Well, no more virtual. It's right out in the open. So this is revivalistic born-again experience, but the radical display has been upped from the first awakening. And after a while, this becomes normative. So if you claim to be born again and cannot name the time and place and did not demonstrate at that time the kind of bodily emotion that has become norm, well, then there's some reason to suspect whether you really are born again. My daughter was in the Yale University, the only a cappella choir. She's really good at music. So when she was a student, she joined this group. It was almost all Korean. She shows up at 11 o'clock Saturday morning for rehearsal. Well, where have you been? Well, it's 5 to 11. I'm on time. I'm a good Dutch girl. I'm on time. Well, where were you for Bible study? Bible study starts at 9 o'clock before this choir rehearsal. And so she came, okay, next time is 9 o'clock. Okay, and now this is testimony time and mutual accountability time. Small group, classic small group dynamics. They come around to Suzanne and say, well, when were you born again? Well, I grew up CRC, and you go to catechism, and this really makes sense to me. I have my questions, I have my doubts, but I'm really on the track here. Well, that was not nearly good enough. And so then they started to get on her, and she quit the choir. This is the template now of evangelicalism going forward. And it's brought, well, not just the camp meeting, but the other famous invention of the Methodists is the circuit rider, the only person out in all kinds of weather besides the postal service. So you see this circuit rider on his bedraggled pony going through all kinds of weather. And then he arrives at a very small community, a few cabins out in the backwoods, and you see him upper right here in action, preaching to the assemblage. So that's the saving souls function. But the equally important function, especially on the raw frontier, where there aren't many neighbors, is to create community. And you see that from a picture from the First Great Awakening. This is a Methodist local meeting in a locality, the people who have felt themselves to be born again. They then meet in a local class, as they called it, every week to, well, there's no preaching or a formal service provided. So they're meeting kind of as a Bible study, mutual accountability small group, reading sermons, singing songs with each other, the creation of community. So evangelicalism is often criticized with some right for being individualistic, but that's only one side of the story. This is also about creating community in a place where there is none, and where the question has remained, what is holding us together? Well, this kind of mutual experience holds us together, and it creates a system of values and ideas and convictions and commitments that we can hold each other to account, to meet, to sew together what otherwise is just a collection of random individuals. Besides charisma, however, and here's why the Methodists became the #1 denomination in the United States, the young country, they matched organization with charisma. Methodists have bishops, right? They have a hierarchy, and they have one of their famous images is the great Methodist machine of wheels within wheels. I think they took it from the prophet Ezekiel, yeah, this vision. But you have at the heart of it, the class meeting, and then people from different groups or different localities will meet together for the quarterly meeting. And then there will be an annual meeting of a wider circle of churches. And it goes all the way out to the top where the bishop presides and arranges for the next year's circuit riders. So, for instance, in West Michigan here, if you're a Methodist circuit rider at the time of the Michigan frontier, right after, say, around the time that Michigan has become a state, 1837, your assignment, you're on the Grand River Circuit. So you will travel from Portland to Grand Haven in a circuit without any roads, following Indian paths or whatever, visiting every little town or cluster of cabins along the way, trying to bring people together, giving them the word, essentially hearing their confessions, administering the sacraments, baptizing children, administering the Lord's Supper. You will do that twice a year, make the circuit. And after 2 years of that, you will be transferred somewhere else. Because these young men, they were called young gifts, as a charismatic. They had no formal education, right? They had 4 books in their saddlebags that they would read as they go from one place to another. No college, not even high school education, but they had the gift. Guys like this tend to be pretty attractive. And there are a lot of lonely girls along the way. And okay, the first visit, second visit, no more. It's a way to keep improper alliances from developing. We want to keep these guys bachelors. But as, well, there's, not remembering the title of the song. Oh yeah, Chris Christopherson, still a lot of wine and lonely girls in this best of all possible worlds, right? So to keep the preachers from settling down. Now the problem in Methodism will be that it's so successful that bigger churches are forming, and they want a stated minister. So the tension here between charisma and organization will both profit, but also is a creative tension, but also will bedevil Methodism for some time to come. So you see the success of Methodism. This is a Methodist percentage of population per county in 1850. You'll see that virtually every county has at least one Methodist church. I haven't explored Ottawa County that much, but if you go into Kent County and go from one township to another, you will find a Methodist church virtually in every township. Methodism on the Protestant side is the default form of religious organization because of this low educational requirements, so low entry requirements, but then a tenacious building of community that will keep easy in from becoming easy out. Okay, you'll bring them in and you'll keep them in. This isn't just on the rural frontier, but also the urban frontier. This is John Street Methodist Church in Manhattan, which is the, even though most of the population growth is on the rural frontier, the cities were growing too. And the established churches, the Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Episcopalians, with the requirements for a formally educated clergy, just couldn't keep up with the supply of ministers. So Methodists were also expanding in the cities. John Street in New York City in Manhattan is sort of the flagship example of this. One of its great Sunday school teachers, she was a she couldn't be ordained, but one of its great Sunday school teachers, Bible class, and one of its greatest theologians is Phoebe Palmer, who is the co-inventor of so-called holiness theology. Problem with Phoebe, she had grown up in a Methodist, she'd been saturated with Christian nurture. Her father, an English immigrant, had gotten his admission card from John Wesley himself. And she knew Jesus from age 2 on. So how do you get born again when you've been born right the first time, right? By saying, essentially, through a great struggle of faith, I mean, it's painful to read her diaries, which she publishes, this private interaction with the Lord. And other people need to hear from my example. It's not just enough to have a first born again experience. You have to have a second conversion, a second dedication, a second blessing, she called it, the baptism of the Holy Spirit, by which you became not just justified, good old Protestant baseline, but sanctified, entirely sanctified, perfect in your lifetime. Now, John Wesley had said, yeah, you got to work at this, and maybe just pretty close to your death, you will achieve it. Phoebe says, no, you can have it now, just like the way you got born again, you could have now. It's your decision. And if you can, you must, because God expects nothing less. And so if you dally with pursuing sanctification, we have prime evidence that your justification is false. Yeah, so this is upping the ante, but it renews the intensity, right? This is the birth of the holiness movement, which by the end of the 19th century is separated out into a lot of different denominations, Salvation Army, most famous among them. But at the same time, right at that time, it becomes the trigger of Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism is born out of this holiness movement. And Pentecostalism, of course, is the biggest Christian growth sector globally in the 20th century. So that is born back here in Manhattan to the wife of a fashionable doctor. So there's a lot of creativity going on. But if you read Phoebe Palmer's account of her spiritual search through a lot, it's very well earned. There's a lot of pain along the way. Besides the Methodists, we have the Baptists, who do not have bishops. They're born essentially out of the Congregational movement. The first Baptists really come out of the First Great Awakening. If you have to be born again to make sure, if you have to have a born again experience to make sure you're saved, then why are we baptizing babies? Baptism should apply to people who have come of age, are morally and intellectually accountable, competent, and so believer baptism only. And all the rest of the folderol of established churches, they don't want any part of. You don't have to have an educated clergy. In fact, if you have an educated clergy, it's pretty prime evidence that they're preaching a false gospel, right? They're having pride in their degree. So again, it's the young gift, but these are not even full-time Christian ministers. These are often the gifted layman, almost always a layman, of the local church who the assembly agrees has the gift of the Holy Ghost and has a command of the scriptures and can preach the true gospel. So you have the farmer preacher, the fisherman preacher, the storekeeper preacher, people who are preparing their sermons kind of in their off hours, kind of like regular ministers, huh, Doug? Yeah. My daughter-in-law, one of our daughters-in-law, has been a Presbyterian minister for 14 years. And when I looked over her schedule, she was essentially a CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation. She got all these prizes for preaching in seminary. And, that was what she had least time for. So maybe the Baptists were onto something. Yeah. Yeah. So it's these folks assemble in very rudimentary structures. We have a clapboard church here with a steeple. They create and propagate their own kind of music. This is shape note singing, the sacred harp, classic music of the American frontier. And they assemble together, the men, and men they are, elder to younger. This is a formidable phalanx of ministers. And when you would confront them up front, you would have the fear of God put into you. This is Thomas Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's father, full-time kind of failed dirt farmer, who was a hard shell Baptist preacher. There were divisions among Baptists, even though they all agreed on Scripture as the only final authority of doctrine. And they disagreed particularly over the Calvinist inheritance of the doctrine of predestination. The hard shells are those who believe in double predestination, that say God elects some to eternal salvation, from eternity, elects some to salvation, but others to reprobation. And a guy like Thomas would say, God takes a little more delight in the reprobation than in the election, right? This is a hard-bitten, hard-edged, double predestinarian kind of Calvinism that some of us, not least me, have been scarred by. Other Baptists are gentler, putting the emphasis on the positive will of God and our commandment, therefore, to participate in the work of God. Abraham Lincoln ran away from this father and this kind of upbringing as fast and far as he could. He got notice that when he was up in Springfield that his father was dying. Didn't go to the funeral. Abraham Lincoln was the antithesis of this, a self-made man, pretty much secular, very rationalistic in his outlook. Teaching the Whig gospel of self-discipline and achievement through education, achieving success in society and doing good for society along the way. Only when he got caught in the throes of the Civil War, you'll see the predestination coming back in his second inaugural address. Both read the same Bible, both pray to the same God. God cannot answer both of them positively. Perhaps he's answered neither favorably. God has his own purpose in this that neither side anticipated. So Abraham showed that you could, at least for a while, outgrow this hard shell father. But he's going to come back. It's Freud calls it the return of the repressed. And the Civil War was a perfect school for that. Okay, local church lay leaders. Great suspicion of outsiders. The church, the local congregation is an autonomous, self-sufficient religious entity with lay preachers who know their people because they're going around a weekday work week like everybody else. They're not highfalutin. They don't know a whole lot of theology, but they know their Bible, and that's enough. Not really, say the people who have educated clergy, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists. So part two is this elite evangelical cultural offensive. And here I would have you attend to the upper part of the map. Andover Seminary outside of Boston, New Haven, Yale and New Haven. We have a great migration from New England across New York State and the upper Midwest. And that's a result of two things. One is the transportation modality opened by the Erie Canal, the most significant public works enterprise in all American history until the water delivery system and the freeways of LA. This allowed New England, the people to escape from the landlocked condition of New England. I mean, otherwise New England would have probably become like the Maritimes in Canada. Really cool to visit, but not part of the central part of the nation. We have starting in 1816, the summer without, or the year without a summer. There had been this huge volcano in present-day Indonesia the year before. There was so much ash in the air that it literally snowed on the 4th of July across New England in 1816. And the crops failed, and you're working with rocky soil anyway. What the heck, let's give up and go west. And they took all their New England culture, their Puritan culture, both political and religious, with them. So we have what I call the Yankee diaspora, the great migration across the Erie Canal, down the Great Lakes, into the lower part of Michigan, the upper part of the Midwest, Interstate 70 kind of is the dividing line. Anything north of that is New England. Anything south of that is Pennsylvania. You can see it in the type of architecture and all sorts of things. So Adrian College is an outpost of this. Olivet College is an outpost of this. Oberlin is really the capital outside of Cleveland, but it also goes across the upper Midwest to Beloit in Wisconsin, Illinois College and Knox College in northern Illinois, out to Grinnell College. Some would argue it extends to Salt Lake City in the form of the Mormons, but we'll get to that next time. So this great Yankee diaspora, you notice I just named a whole bunch of colleges, taking along education. Education and the desire to turn the kingdom of this world into the kingdom of our Lord, which is the original Puritan project. God, for the Puritans, did not just save individuals, God saved societies. So we have to make a holy commonwealth, a righteous society, but now in the context where we have the disestablishment of religion. So we're going to create a holy commonwealth by voluntary means. That requires persuasion. Would you like regeneration? Yes, you would. And Timothy Dwight here, president of Yale, grandson of Edwards, as I said, Yale in the lower middle, Andover Seminary in the lower right. These New England schools generate the ministers, the missionaries, and the educators, and the political activists that take this vision westward. And two of the premier voices here are Lyman Beecher, upper right, and Charles Finney, lower center. Look at Charles Finney's eyes.
Mhm.
Can you say no to this man? Many of the great zealots of the Second Great Awakening were converted by him. So Lyman Beecher is a student of Timothy Dwight. He was born again under Dwight's auspices early in the 19th century. And he becomes the great organizer of this evangelical cultural and social offensive. He preaches on Long Island, then up in Connecticut, takes the offensive to Boston, where he tries to convert Boston back from Unitarianism, fails. And so he goes and sets up, lower right here, Lane Seminary, Presbyterian Seminary in Cincinnati, the Queen City of the West, right? Cincinnati, I think, was the fourth largest city in the United States at the time, stood right at the head of the Ohio River, which is the highway to the interior. He was the great organizer, as well as a very good revival preacher. But Charles Finney excels them all as an educated revival preacher. He takes the popular style, but mixes it with high-end theology and cultural formation aspirations. He is a revivalist along the so-called burned over district, which is right along the Erie Canal. Burned over because it's been consumed by the fires of revival so many times that there's nothing left to set a fire. He sets up on Broadway, literally, Broadway Tabernacle, to try to bring this kind of elite revivalism to the big city. And when, after 3 or 4 years of that, he says, well, it's time to create a new phalanx of people just like me. And so he's not the founder, but he really puts Oberlin College on the map. Oberlin College is the first co-educational and racially integrated institution of higher learning in America. So whatever you think of evangelicals today, in many ways, these guys are the most politically and socially progressive people on the map. And they got into a lot of controversy because of it. Charles Finney had been educated by the local judge, educated to become a lawyer. And then he had a lot of spiritual conflict on the tempest of soul, and he's out sitting out in nature, and the Spirit descends upon him. He goes back to his office. He has a born-again experience, and he says, I'm going to give up my legal career. I'm going to preach for God. But he never shook it, that training. He said, I approached my audience like a lawyer approaches a jury. Tried to convince them of an evidence and just hammer them with iron logic until they came over to his point of view. But he was organized as well. Before he brought a revival to one of these towns in New York, upstate New York, say, he would make a visit and he would call upon the matrons of the village, the older women with teenage or just about young adult children. And they would have a prayer meeting. And he would find out the gossip of the village, who's doing what with whom and all that, and who are the souls that might be in need of salvation and more likely to incline toward that decision. And then he would come back and hold these all-night meetings, protracted revivals, night after night after night, now in a town rather than out in the backwoods. And he would call upon people by name. And he would have some of these mothers rise up from their pew and pray publicly. Big no-no. Women conducting religious leadership in the face of men. Well, when they start crying out, oh Lord, save my wandering son. How's wandering son sitting right next to her? How's that going to go? Sooner or later, these folks will come up to the anxious seat in the front, right below the pulpit. There's a bench, the anxious bench, the anxious seat, where people who are on the verge of conversion can sit and face the crowd. So this is well-engineered group psychology, huh? And yeah, he was very successful. His greatest success was in Rochester, where he went on like this for 9 months, from 1830 to 1831, with astounding success. and he made missionary journeys to England to bring the method there. So both in the effectiveness of their revival preaching to a higher end audience. So Finney, when he came to town, he also wanted to know who's the mayor, who are the town councilmen, who are the lawyers, who are the lawyers. I know how to talk to lawyers. Who are the doctors? He would go after the educated people, particularly male leaders. Congregations at that time were about 2 to 1 female. So his ability to convert proud, educated young men was his real calling card, and made him very popular with mothers everywhere, because their wandering sons could be brought into the fold and could therefore exert all kinds of cultural leadership, right? So how did this turn into cultural formation? The creation of the so-called benevolence empire. As I said, this is a quest to reestablish or shoot for the goals of a holy commonwealth, of a righteous society, not just a collection of born-again individuals, but a righteous society. But to do that without the benefit of state establishment. Lyman Beecher said, when they disestablished the church in Connecticut in 1817, I thought it was a calamity. It turned out to be the best news we've ever had, because now we have to go out and earn it and bring it, not just force people to conform to rules up here, but to take in the rules in their heart. And this will be incline them to this will be much more a better motivation than that old establishment. But above all these different denominations, sorry about the spacing here, Congregationalist, Presbyterian, and the Dutch Reformed, people out of the Reformed or Calvinistic theological background, they created parachurch organizations that would collaborate. So we're moving out of denominational silos themselves and creating bridges to create increased cooperation among them for all kinds of moral and social causes. Each of these has a parachurch organization behind it. First of all, just spreading the word. The American Home Missionary Society, supported by all these denominations, the American Tract Society, the American Bible Society. The American Home Missionary Society created colleges, Williams, Amherst, Bowdoin, Colby, all the minor Ivies across New England, but also Oberlin and the ones I mentioned before, half of the MIAA, created colleges where farm boys with some gift could go for a college education and have their way paid with scholarship funds generated by the society. And this was so successful that even though the population was increasing 8-fold, the supply of ministers increased 25-fold. So even though we have a much larger population, proportionate to population, there were 3 times more ministers per capita in 1850 than there had been at the time of the Revolution. Remember that low figure of church affiliation at the time of the Revolution, 6%? That was partly a supply side problem. You didn't have ministers out there organizing these people, supplying the latent want. Then you have the American Tract Society, creating a vast array of popular print on issues of the day in a nicely portable form. And the American Bible Society. These two were by far the largest publishers in the United States. They dwarfed any kind of publishing house. Plus you had, every denomination had its own newspaper. The only organization that produced more newspapers and magazines than the churches were the political parties. And between those two, church and political party, the United States had far more newspapers and magazines than any other country in the world. It really benefited from the first and best postal system in the world, which would take these journals to every household, even on the remotest frontier. Lincoln served in that function in the small towns of Illinois. Yeah? But also there's a quest not just to talk the talk, but walk the walk. Let's have let's popularize and, spread Christian behavior with a lot of antis. A good Christian, if you're born again, you will not go to the theater. Partly because theaters were notorious pickup sites. The third tier of the theater at this time was where sex workers plied their trade, with the flotsam and jetsam of young men working the other trades in the city. Dancing, you know what dancing will lead to. Gambling, carnivals. Carnivals are occasions for theater, dancing, and gambling all at once, all around the countryside. So let's create a consensus of opinion against these. Then the good old Puritan dream of a public Sabbath, where the whole community quits its regular activities and devotes a day to church going and meditation, Bible reading, prayer upon the things of God. Let's reestablish the Sabbath. And one of the great early critical political disputes at the time was, should the post office deliver mail on Sunday? The Sabbatarians say no, that's desecrating the Sabbath day, because the mail would be delivered by these carriages, these wagons that would rumble into town, 4 horses drawing and making a lot of noise, the driver blowing on his post horn and disrupting the calm of the Sabbath, and everybody scrambling to consult their phones rather than listening, thinking about what the Domini said that morning, right? We want to create an environment where the minister, the Word of God, has a communications monopoly for a day, and we don't want this other junk coming in. Then the real differentiating behavior, drinking alcohol. Temperance or prohibition, viewing alcohol consumption as a sin, did not begin with the Puritans. The Puritans could pack down rum with anybody. And at ordination services, record shows that sometimes the ordinand had to be held on his horse back to his town because, these guys knew how to party. The sin is not in the substance, Puritan theology says. The sin is not in the substance, but in the abuse of the substance. The sin is not in sex, but in the abuse of sex. The sin is not in money, but the abuse of money, okay? With Victorians, because this is the birth of the Victorian era, the sin becomes it lies in the substance itself, and the key behavior here is alcohol consumption. Now, there was a lot to be reformed. In 1820, by best estimate of manufacture and sale, the average drinker who was an adult, a male above the age of 15, the average drinker was putting down 3/5 a week. Okay, so 1/2 every day. So in order to get ready for work, you got to have a shot. Comes coffee time, we don't have coffee, we have a shot or 2 at noon. Pick me up in the afternoon, a celebratory drink before you go home, and then another, with dinner, another nightcap. 3/5 of alcohol a week. Now, in my worst days as a college student, in those summers, maybe 1/5 a week, maybe 1/5 a week, but 3/5 a week. That was 1820. By 1850, alcohol consumption per capita had been cut by 80%. So this campaign did work. It became a sin to drink alcohol. But on the principle that if some is good, more is better, what about that last 20%? So around 1850, the drive turns very concertedly from temperance to prohibition. Invoke the power of the state to put an end to the manufacture of alcohol. And the state of Maine does that in 1851. Previously, they tried to invoke the power of the state to stop the Sunday delivery of mail. they would try to invoke the power of the county board not to allow the carnival to come to town, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a crucial question here. Do we create this good behavior out of voluntary obedience, adherence to the law of God, as the preacher has explained it? Or do we use the power of the state and impose it on everybody? Politics was the other game in town, big game in town besides religion. In the election of 1840, fully over 80% of the eligible electorate turned out, over 80%. And that set the bar for the rest of the century. The 20th century, and the more emphasis we have on democracy, the less actual voting there is proportionally. So if we hit 60%, I don't know what it was last November, if we hit 60%, that's a massive turnout, right? So politics is very engaging because, not least because it engages these moral questions. And the Northern evangelicals were very much part of the Whig Party, which had inherited the mantle from the Federalist Party at the time, right after the Revolution, and would become, the Whig Party would go out of business in the 1850s and be replaced by the Republican Party. So the Whig Party was the party of big government activism to promote economic growth and to regulate personal behavior. The Democrats were the party of small government, small both in terms of economic development, because you're going to privilege some people and not others, but also personal behavior is none of the government's business. The big question in the room, the big reform in the room, of course, is slavery and anti-slavery. Prior to 1830, most whites in the North who had were uneasy about slavery advocated something called colonization. That is to say, exactly what Thomas Jefferson says in his notes on the state of Virginia. Slavery cannot continue forever, but Black people and white people cannot live peaceably side by side. This just can't happen. So we'll take all the Black people from America, transport them somewhere, Haiti or Bolivia or wherever, and import all kinds of white guys from England. That was his solution. And a lot of people also in the North bought this. Black people and white people cannot live side by side. Objectively speaking, the material condition of freed people in the North, in northern cities, could often be worse than the condition of enslaved workers on the plantation. Because those owners in the South needed their guys to be able to go out into the field the next day to work. In the North, you don't have to care anything about them. So colonization seemed to be the solution. But then around 1830, abolitionism started migrating out of Black ranks, where it always had been strong, and white people started getting infused with the desire to abolish slavery in the United States, like right now, or at least make a commitment right now, revivalistically, make a commitment to right now to push for an end of slavery in the United States. This is naturally given to kind of a revival. This naturally appealed to part of the revival audience. Make a decision right now on a matter of utmost importance, kind of a salvation question for the Republic, not just for yourself. But yeah, cleanse yourself of sin, because as members of the American Republic, we are implicated in slavery. Cast that sin out for yourself and cast it out of the Republic. So where this New England migration goes, anti-slavery, white abolitionism grows. And it comes out of the same dynamic. So we have here Theodore Weld on the right, an heir of the old Puritan Commonwealth. His ancestor had been one of the founders of Harvard College. His grandfather had been a minister who baptized John Quincy Adams. I mean, this guy is a New England Puritan blue blood who's now out west. He gets born again. He gets converted in a Finney revival. Finney had, in his early consultation, his background research, Finney had heard from Theodore's Tanta that this boy is rebelling against the faith and he needs Jesus. So Tanta makes sure that she's sitting between Theodore and the aisle. And Finney is drilling right in on him. He is looking him in the eyes and talking about the demand for you to take Jesus right now and don't put it off till tomorrow, because do you know whether you're going to survive the night? I mean, do you? Do you? Theodore tries to step up and walk out. Tanta blocks his way with her knees. And so between the two of them, he is subjected to a drilling that he cannot resist. And he becomes an enthusiastic born-again guy. He first sets off to be a temperance zealot. Then he turns to manual education. This is a way that you can have farm boys go to work their way through college. He goes down to Lane Seminary to become a minister, Lyman Beecher Seminary. He leads a rebellion, or I'm sorry, they start to proselytize and encourage Black people in Cincinnati. The authorities of the seminary try to put the kibosh on it. He leads half of the student body up to Oberlin. And by then he's dedicated himself to abolitionism. He is the most successful, the most powerful abolitionist recruiter in the upper Midwest, across Ohio and into New York. He tries to recruit other people to carry on this activity like him. And one of them is the very fair Angelina Grimke, daughter of the Charleston, South Carolina slaveocracy, the elite. Her family is one of the biggest slaveholding families in Carolina, and therefore they're very wealthy. And she starts having qualms of conscience about this. And so she leaves, she and her sister go up to Philadelphia, and they convert from Presbyterianism to Quakerism. And they they start participating in anti-slavery meetings, anti-slavery activity. Well, Angelina is one of the people recruited by Theodore to his training sessions, and things happen. Boy, this guy was so repressed. You should read the letter that he finally sends to Angelina, pouring out his heart and love. It's embarrassing. No publisher, no fiction publisher today would accept this as realistic. So she says yes, and but this is after her own. He's a very successful trainer of her as an orator. She is the first woman to address, as it was quaintly called at the time, promiscuous assemblies. That is, say, where men and women are sitting together. Women were not allowed to do that. We're not just testifying from the pew now, we're up in the podium. And she is very successful as an abolitionist orator. She's the first woman to address a formal session of a state legislature. She gets up in the Boston State House and addresses the assembly there. And they're married and they live happily ever after, right? Well, no, they both burn out. And by 1844, they've given up abolitionism and they've given up evangelical Christianity, because what it takes to convince a mass society goes against that purity of heart and that singleness of purpose, that purity of soul that impelled you into the business in the first place. So there's just like there's a tricky dynamic in Methodism between charisma and organization, so there's a tricky dynamic here between purity of soul and reform of society. You get involved in all kinds of organizational dynamics. You become kind of a mechanic of persuasion. One of Wells' other great letters, you can read these in Ann Arbor, by the way, in the Clements Library. He has a horrible handwriting. I ruined my eyes in that library, but Not as bad as Abraham Kuyper's, though. I really ruined my eyes in Amsterdam. But anyway, he's a young pup, maybe 2 years out from this revival experience with Finney. He writes, "Dear brother Finney," a heartfelt letter. Hasn't revivalism become kind of a mechanism for you? Hasn't it become kind of a rote business? Attend to the purity of your heart. Pray earnestly, brother Finney, whether you are still in line with the will of God. I mean, the audacity of this guy. But once you let this genie of purity and sincerity out of the bottle, it's really hard to put it back in. And also, it's very hard to coordinate that with mass movement social reform, which is they're required to do. We'll get into this more next time, but out of this, these early white abolitionism in the 1830s comes questions by 1840s. How do we do this? Radical agitation, like William Lloyd Garrison, a good Baptist boy, good born-again evangelical, until he gets so sick of the church's complicity in slavery that he becomes a Christian anti-clerical, Christian anti-institutionalized religion? Or do you work like Lyman Beecher's most famous daughter, Harriet Beecher Stowe? Do you work by moral influence? She wrote the best-selling book of the entire 19th century, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Between taking care of like 7 kids and a household, she was married to a theology professor who couldn't organize lunch. It's really quite an amazing career that she had. She became the most popular author in America. Or do you resort to politics? William Lloyd Garrison thought that anyone who was involved in political anti-slavery agitation had lost the cause. He was dead set against government and thought that using politics to promote moral ends was a contradiction in terms, because politics is inherently immoral. State coercion is inherently immoral. So we have rising popularity of abolitionism, but real fracturing inside that movement over what are the proper tactics and strategy to take. Those who did take the political means and found that the Whig Party, like the big churches, were too compromised, found the so-called Liberty Party. They didn't have that many votes in 1844, maybe 3-4% of the national vote. But you see where it's concentrated. This is a party of the Yankee diaspora, you see? And it wasn't enough to decide the election, because the Liberty Party vote drew off the Whig Party vote in New York State, and therefore it allowed the Democrats to take the electoral votes in New York State, and that put them over the top. And that put into the White House the most aggressive pro-slavery annexationist the country's ever seen, James K. Polk. So devoting yourself to purity in politics turns the election over to your worst enemy. Okay, I've been politically active my whole life, and ever since college, I've been wandering around this thing. Politics can be a harsh teacher. And so is it better not to participate in politics at all, or to go out there with a pure party and perhaps deliver the cause over to the worst enemy? Something that might apply in our own time. Let you talk about that. Okay. Thirdly, we have in the Second Great Awakening, the real beginnings of Black Christianization. To understand this, we have to look at the very often understudied and unknown slave trade, not the international slave trade, which ends in 1808, but the birth of the takeoff, therefore, of the domestic slave trade in 1808. And we have a mass movement of young people being uprooted from their families and their native clime, very often Virginia, and sent off into the Southwest. What happened was that tobacco agriculture so ruins the soil that the economy of colonial Virginia was kind of running out of gas. So George Washington, for instance, had converted from tobacco farming to grain farming. You go to Mount Vernon, you can see his little corn mill, his wheat mill out back there, very ingenious device. But enslaved labor is not economically sensible for grain farming. It just doesn't make sense. So that's why people were more and more hopeful that slavery was on the way out in the late 1700s. Slavery would die away. You have this huge, however, huge black enslaved population in Virginia and Maryland. The invention of the cotton gin by the good New Haven mechanic Eli Whitney. We used to walk that street together, huh? Past his little gun manufacturing. The invention of the cotton gin gave a whole new birth to slavery and turned what on the right-hand map there you see, turned the wilderness of southwest of the south part of the United States into the great black belt of cotton production. And this means that you can remove the surplus black population from Virginia and redistribute it all across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and into Texas. By the way, by the time of the Civil War, 25% of the cotton in the United States was being grown within 100 miles of Dallas. The acquisition of Texas was a great boom to the extension of the cotton and therefore slavery empire. So you see on the left-hand map here, the migration routes often done on foot or once again in shackles in the holds of ships. Great migration, forced deportation from the upper South along the East Coast, deeper and deeper into the interior of America. Look at the charts at the leftmost part of that map. Slave population in the South, upper South increases regularly, but it just balloons in the lower South. We have a 250,000 enslaved Black people in the lower South in 1810. We have 10 times that by the time of the Civil War. This is one of the greatest forced displacements in world history since the transatlantic slave trade itself. So it's estimated that between 1 and 1.2 million people were displaced this way. And these are kind of teenagers, typically. Young laborers torn up and sent into a strange land. And it's exactly as part of this process that we have Black substantial conversion to Christianity. First of all, the end of the transatlantic slave trade meant that there were no fresh reinforcements of African religion coming into your neighborhood. You lost touch with the teachers of the old country's religion. Secondly, this domestic slave trade shredded families and created a need for new relationships and a new identity. And evangelical Christianity, Black style, gave you that. It said, I know who I am, I belong to God, and I know where I am, I belong to my fellow believers here, all alike suffering under oppression. So we have a Black style of evangelical Christianity that's step by step formed and developed in these circumstances. Reabsorbing and repurposing the African heritage, reasserting the dignity and meaning amid very hostile circumstances. And we have, I was going to say a bipolar Christianity here, but I don't mean it in our normal sense. We have a Christianity with two poles. Jesus is my Savior, and Moses is my liberator. So the book of Exodus is, all Christians have their canon within the canon, right? Martin Luther really revolved around 3 books: Romans, Psalms, and 1 Peter. Old Testament prophets are my favorite. The canon within the canon for Black people begins with the book of Exodus. Go down, Moses, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. So Jesus for eternal life, Moses, the example of Moses as triggering hope in this life. And there's African heritage is absorbed typically, particularly in the ritual behavior of this kind of Christianity. In the upper picture, we have a modern enactment of an old African style that's adapted to evangelicalism. This is the ring show, where you revolve in circles, orbit in circles, with call and response, essentially working yourself up to an ecstatic posture whereby you feel the Holy Spirit. And then the spirituals and other songs that are the work songs of these forced labor camps, which we call plantations, keeping the hope alive. In the North, where slavery becomes illegal, is driven out over time. We have the emergence of independent Black churches, the longest standing Black denominations in the United States, the AME, or African Methodist Episcopal Church, Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia. Next time you're at Independence Mall, walk a few blocks over. This is a very imposing structure. And surprising things can happen. Last time I was there, our daughter was doing her doctorate at Penn, so we got to Philadelphia fairly often. And I walked over. Let's check out Mother Bethel. Ring the bell, ushered in, meet the senior pastor. Oh, what's your name? I mean, where are you from? I'm in West Michigan. Oh, you know any people at Western Seminary? I went to seminary there. And this Black guy, pastor of one of the most prestigious African-American churches in the United States, is playing Dutch name bingo with me. I mean, in case you wonder whether God has a sense of humor. The pioneer pastors here are Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, who are treated as second-class believers at St. George's Methodist Church, a white Methodist church, or a biracial Methodist church. They're treated so rudely that they set out to form Mother Bethel themselves. In New York City, we have AME Zion denomination, pioneered by James Varick. And so these are major educational and social service, as well as conventional preaching and religious denominations. This is where the leadership cadre of African-American 19th century are nurtured. In the South, we have a very different situation. This is homegrown grassroots religion. So we have the young gift in the doorway here in the picture on the lower right, the exhorter who has Jesus and wants to get you there. And we have the same sorts of behavior as we see at camp meetings. Ecstatic possession, by which great anxiety turns into the feeling of salvation. Because there are no bishops or anything allowed, it's the Baptist evangelical tradition that's more popular with African Americans. Some people relate this back to West Africa, where local spiritual powers are often identified with rivers. Kind of makes sense. I'm not sure how strong that argument is, but I kind of believe it. Anyway, full immersion baptism, by which you die to your old life and you're brought out new life in Christ, new identity, new community, whatever the master's telling you. But it's not just public exhibits, it's also private. Field preaching, kind of on the left-hand side, kind of like a camp meeting, only you can't have as formal an apparatus or as many days apart. And then these things called on the right-hand side depicted hush harbors, brush arbors, a little place back in the woods on the edge of the plantation where you can kind of create a canopy of trees and branches and so forth and carry on, and that brush arbor will absorb the sound of your meeting, so Old Massa doesn't know you're there. Brush arbor, also called hush harbor. So this is a spontaneous and self-directed, self-developing kind of religion, very folk kind of religion, with a lot of African styles, African methods, and liturgical elements, ritual elements, mixed in with Christian teaching. It's estimated that at least 5, probably 10% of African Americans under slavery in the South were literate, even though it was illegal. They were self-taught or managed by kind, not masters, typically plantation mistresses. They learned to read the Bible. And they exhibited, the people who heard these scriptures read could exhibit prodigious feats of memory. They could replicate Romans. They could recite that to you. So the word of God is suppressed and repressed with great difficulty. And the masters knew that this was a time bomb. And so they tried to control the kind of Christianity that was exhibited on plantation, but no, you can't keep that genie in the bottle either. Okay, we have just a couple minutes for questions. I'm sorry for running over. So the United States was not founded as a Christian country, but with these 3 movements or these 3 pieces, it became one functionally by the time of the Civil War. Question? Yeah.
You talked a lot about rise in evangelism in the first part of your presentation. What about Native Americans? I mean, did they have any influences in these evangelistic things?
Native Americans. There had been early on in New England these praying towns. So there was evangelization by Puritans, much more by the Moravians in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. But they were really sequestered and treated as third-class Christians by the white Christians. So yeah, as more and more of them were confined to reservations, you would have a kind of a Christian component there. On the same reservation, you have people reacting very much against that, reasserting native traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you get interesting blends of that. So yeah, evangelization of Indians was not nearly as successful because it wasn't nearly as tried as evangelization of African Americans.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Linda down here. You're going to give me the question for next time?
In one description of the actual delivery of Jonathan Edwards' old famous Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, I have taught that sermon to college students for many years because it's in most anthologies of American literature, including in China, by the way.
Yeah.
Talked with a Chinese student who's coming to the United States for college if he can. And I asked what works of literature he'd read in their anthologies. 8th graders in China are reading Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God as their introduction to American religion. So it would be nice if someone would choose another sermon, but
Yeah.
as you read that sermon, the account I read was that that when he actually gave it, Edwards never finished the sermon.
Right.
People were falling down in the aisles because they knew what was coming.
Yeah.
It's this big, long sermon of you without God. And then at the very end, and now you have a great opportunity. And then that's the call to. But most people were already up there or whatever. Now, does that mean that when he would deliver that, that would be in a very high, a lot of yelling, excitement and so forth? Or would he be doing it more deadpan to get that, you know,
He rarely raised his voice above a monotone. If you want dramatic style, you have to go to his friend George Whitefield,
Okay,
who was born in the theater.
complete contrast to Whitefield.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of, the drama is behind what he's
Right.
saying as he's building this up.
But he's such a good rhetorician that the words even delivered in a very moderate tone, just cut through. It was also very they were not used to this sort of preaching. The model of preaching at that time was Aristotelian. You preach to the head and let the head filter down the safe stuff to the heart. And Jonathan Edwards saw, to his credit, that out of the heart are the issues of life. You go right to the affections. Now, affections are not the same thing as emotions. And he never tried to give that sermon again. It represents a very small part of his total sermonic corpus. And he really criticized people who were finding confidence of their salvation in their emotional exercises.
Yeah.
He preached right against that. So he kind of unleashed something that he couldn't control.
Right, but you're not thinking, he's not in the camp that is being extremely dramatic.
No.
And hysterics.
He was very suspicious of
No.
that. He thought that that was just as much an idol as pride of intellect.
But he was equally as effective overall in his career, we're saying.
Yeah, well.
But more for some sermons like the Divine and Supernatural Light, which
Yeah,
would have
yeah.
been a much better sermon to choose for the Chinese
Yeah,
students to
well,
read.
my great longstanding teacher, George Marsden, who wrote the biography of Edwards, said that Edwards' best sermon, most indicative sermon is Heaven is a World of Love. So Edwards, when he's a 14-year-old college student at Yale, reads John Locke with great delight and ravishment of spirit. That's how your 14-year-old was too, yeah? And also discovers Isaac Newton. And so toward the mature part of his life, he sees the moral and spiritual world in Newtonian terms. So Isaac Newton describes a physical world that operates by the law of gravity, and the laws of motion. What is the law in the moral and spiritual world? It is the law of love. This is the law that we should seek to obey, the law of love. And our sins and our problems are resisting that law. And that's how we get into so much trouble. So give up and love one another, and but like John Calvin, who has similar things, he is so emphatic or just so mindful of the way these proud, disobedient human beings disobey their father. He really gets ticked off. And he's constantly calling them to that effect. And we should know that, he has this very successful revival in the mid-1730s in Northampton. In 1750, he's booted out because they can't take him anymore. And he's sent to the mission field. He's a missionary in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which is home to a big Mohican village. Jonathan Edwards Jr. grew up with Mohican as his native language. A colony of that ends up kind of around Green Bay in the 1830s. So, yeah, Indian reservation was where you were sent for bad behavior as a minister. Okay, one more. Okay, next time in the morning, we'll meet at 9:30 here next Monday. And we're going to do all the rebels and searchers who are passionate about religion but don't want this stuff. There's all kinds of experimentation. And then the afternoon, we'll find out why Christianity, evangelical Christianity in particular, could not solve the greatest political problem and moral problem the United States had. So we'll see you then. Thank you.